Greetings friends, and welcome back to the Sunshine State Rails. In this video we're going to take a quick look at a couple of CSX's work trains that they've run within my territory over the course of this past winter and maintenance season. What's interesting about these trains though is that they utilize an engine that CSX has very recently acquired from Wabtec, and they utilize a very interesting set of technological advancements. The two work trains that we'll stumble upon in this video included the first two instances of these new locomotives that I would be able to see. So we'll talk about them here in this video. And behind me is also a variant of an EMD 16-cylinder engine. And take a note of the size of this thing, because the engines that we're going to look at today utilize a prime mover a lot smaller than this. We're going to start here in Bradenton, Florida, at the throat of CSX's Tropicana yard on a very gloomy and cold morning, January 23rd of 2025. Despite the unique opportunity that lies ahead, this 41-degree, rainy and windy morning is some of the most miserable weather you could be in, no matter where you are. I wandered over here this morning as one of CSX's track geometry trains symboled W001 would be in town. They had arrived the night before and had tied down on one of the bypass tracks around the yard. There was word about that they would be getting a crew to return to Tampa sometime this early morning, so I made my way over to see what I could find. The track geometry train in and of itself is a very interesting and rather rare bird. CSX only has, I believe, two of these consists running their system year-round, and this particular set is now made up of three cars: a fairly standard stainless coach named the Detroit, a converted baggage car named the Florence, and the last and most important of the three being an observation car named the TGC-2, standing for Track Geometry Car 2. Now this car is where all of the magic aboard this tiny train really happens, but we'll talk more about the TGC-2 in a little while. As we're mainly focused on the lead locomotive assigned to this short train, CSX number 1713, classified by Wabtec as an ET23DCM, though CSX's designation for these rather odd logos is an SD23T4. A rather short description of this Frankenstein-like project is that this is basically an EMD SD40 body fitted with a General Electric 6-cylinder prime mover, while also being modified to meet the EPA's Tier 4 emission standards. Teardowns for production of these odd units began somewhere around late 2022, with completed units finally hitting the rails for revenue service somewhere around early 2024. CSX only ordered 14 of these new units for their roster, numbered 1713 through 1727, so this is the lowest numbered of these on their system, perhaps ironically enough. But it seems that number 1713 has now been assigned to this geometry train set. Initial talks when these units were in production had them potentially being full-time road service units on mixed freights and other long-distance trains, though their current roughly year of service time has proven that to not really have been the case. CSX has seemed to prefer using these locomotives in a similar fashion to which they still use their surviving EMD SD40 variants, such as in small-town local service or on variable distance work trains, such as tie trains, rail trains, or this track geometry train. Case in point, as I'll showcase here, the very first instance of an SD23 I'd ever see in revenue service was on our clinch field trip to CSX's Kingsport subdivision in December of 2023. We'd catch some WO something symboled rail train coming south out of Kingsport across Colonial Heights Road. Number 1727 was in the trailing spot. What's rather interesting about these engines is that they completely scream EMD if not for the prime mover inside. The locomotive's chassis, trucks, cab, and electrical generators are all original EMD parts, but the prime mover inside is an inline i6 Wabtec engine. On account for the prime mover being such a small size, the long hood in and of itself was shortened, leaving for a much larger platform area on the rear of the engine, and the large radiator that is there to comply with the Tier 4 emission standards is so large that it overhangs the long hood on the rear end. As we'll come to find out later, this is a prime mover type that has never been utilized in the railroad industry before, and makes for some really odd experiences with it as a result. It's cold, man. Bloody cold. Finally cutting to the chase, called around 7 o'clock, our crew would show up to their train at about 8:15. They would do some basic walkarounds of the consist to make sure nothing was dragging or left standing from the night before they get ready to call dispatch to shove the train all the way back to Tampa. Since there are no Ys or loop tracks down here at the bottom of the western system in Bradenton, they'd have to push this thing all the way back to the yard at Tampa. The Palmetto subdivision, which is the stretch of track between here at Bradenton and East Tampa, is all dark territory and controlled by track warrants, meaning that no train can operate over any part of the route without explicit permission from Jacksonville Dispatch, and only one train can hold authority over one part of the line at any time. At the same time also, the southbound L700 local train was making its way south from Tampa to bring some traffic down to the Tropicana plant here at Bradenton, and they had authority over the track as it stood now, so the geometry train would not be going anywhere until the good old juice train made it into town. So I sat around for a while to wait on him to make the trip down here, and I sat around just a bit too long, forgetting how crowded Florida has become and the traffic that I'd have to battle to get anywhere else. So by the time my scanner went off telling me that L700 was requesting the Big Manatee River drawbridge to be lowered for their crossing, traffic would hold me up long enough that by the time I made it to State Road 64 to try and get set up elsewhere, the train was already there. But the timing worked out also pretty well for me that I was practically at the front of the line of traffic when the train arrived. So at 9:45 a.m., with their two captive biodiesel-burning CM44 locomotives as power, the L700 crosses southbound across State Road 64 with a very mixed consist in tow. Over the course of these last couple years that I really haven't been present on this subdivision of CSX that I really grew up on, this L700 has picked up basically every southern duty assigned to other trains years prior. What I mean by that is, industries or customers served by other trains have now simply been tacked on to the duties of this train, so in essence it takes longer for it to get its work done. In other years, this train would have been in the plant by 7:30 in the morning. Now it's almost 2 hours, arguably late, but it does a lot of other things that it never did before. That includes switching Conrad Yelvington and Port Manatee on the appropriate days. Also, they may go on duty later now out of Yeoman, but I'm not entirely sure if that's true. Either way, as it has countless times throughout the previous years, this train continues to change, and I can't say how much of it is for the better. But at least the timing of everything made for some extra rail action in this minimalistic part of Bradenton on this very rather miserable morning. Once the local cleared and traffic got moving, I cut through the parking lot of the Bradenton's eye doctor's office, the former Bradentown Depot, over to the road crossing of 3rd Avenue West, just shy of the Big Manatee River. The same crossing where I shot my first ever juice train back in 2016. Pretty much the moment the L700 cleared the yard lead switch at Tropicana, the track warrant for the Palmetto subdivision was handed over to the W00123. So our work train was now the only entity allowed to use the stretch of track between Bradenton and East Tampa until they released any one or all parts of it back to dispatch. The exchange, in fact, was so timely that the Alafaya River Bridge tender didn't even raise the Big Manatee draw span before the work train came north, and it wasn't likely he felt any need to anyway, as I can't imagine that many people would be on the water waiting for the bridge to rise in this kind of weather. So the work train now shoves through downtown Bradenton on their return trip to Tampa, and here we'll take a moment and discuss the TGC2, the now leading track geometry car. As you can tell here, it's fitted with an electronic bell, horn, and headlights, but that's not the only electronics that this computer is fitted with. The TGC2 is effectively the electronic brain of this entire train. The computers and microprocessors linked to electronic and laser-like sensors on the bottom of this car scan the track and right-of-way at any given point as the train passes over. These lighted and infrared sensors scan the rail and roadbed for any non-visual defects invisible to the naked human eye. This train set allows for scans to be made of long distances of right-of-way so that reports can be made for upcoming maintenance seasons, at which point the maintenance-of-way crews working on the lines can repair things found that may not have been caught by visual inspectors. Though none of that intricate scanning would be happening on this return trip. Since the piece of plate glass on the end of TGC2 is pretty see-through, we can tell that there is only one guy in the back of that car. Should the W001 have been doing inspections and scans of the track, there would be a crew of roughly 8 employees inside this car at any time. But none of those folks would be present today, just the engineer and conductor for W001. The conductor riding in the TGC2, only there to operate the functions of the car and call out the conditions of the track ahead to the engineer operating Locomotive 1713. The scans of the track were all done the day prior when it made its initial trip to Bradenton, and this was basically just a deadhead to get the train back to Yeoman Yard before it would start its next assignment. So no scanning or anything intricate was happening here. It was just a move back to the yard. A quick jump north of downtown Palmetto before the US 41 overpass for one last shot as the train leaves town. I'd have to make my way into work pretty shortly after this, so this was all I was going to see this morning. But a rather interesting note considering that there's a Wabtec 6-cylinder engine under the hood of the 1713 is that it sounded pretty quiet coming past us here. And from research and videos that I've seen, these engines are pretty quiet in general use and light loading such as here. But under a heavy load and RPMs pushed wide open, they sound variably different. And that's what we're about to see. Now we're gonna jump around the list a little bit. Now we're back at December 17th of 2024, as my buddy Christian and I had made an evening run to CSX's Florida S-Line to enjoy some wintry Florida weather. And the end of this train that you're watching us follow through Dade City is the result of us having heard something going north a few miles further back, but having been unable to tell what train it was or what was leading it. So we figured we'd just jump ahead of it somewhere and figure out what it was when it came by us.
Bro, are you... Okay.
Setting up at Owensboro Road, featuring Christian nearly having a spaz attack, the train would show itself pretty shortly, and we were not expecting what was about to roll by. Leading this mystery train out of the woods was another ET23DCM. This one, the sister to the 1713 we just saw, now number 1714. This was the last thing that we were expecting to see, especially considering that at this point this was only the second instance of an SD23 that I'd ever seen, and the first one that I had seen leading anything. So adding to the surprise element that nothing could have prepared us for seeing an SD23 solo on the head of this thing, but also that as the train passed it seemed to be made up of entirely gondolas. We still had no idea what this thing was, but we weren't going to let it get away. We followed suit and leapfrogged it once again to the Rurdell crossovers for our next shot. Eventually, after all of this chasing business was said and done, we'd find out that this mystery train was symboled W95516, which was an empty tie train returning from Winter Haven. At some point, this entire consist would have been loaded with brand new railroad ties set to be installed somewhere along the system. Now they've all been unloaded and the train is returning empty, headed for Baldwin, Florida. At least that was the routing on the train's profile. I'm not sure if they got another symbol after Baldwin or if the train ended up getting combined into something else. But we knew what opportunity also followed suit right after this, pacing the train between St. Catherine and Bushnell, an activity we've partaken in perhaps one too many times before, but it would be in no short supply for this work train. And now that the engine is at speed and under load, take a listen to how the prime mover of this thing sounds now that we're right next to it. Now, I don't have any confirmation on exactly how accurate this following information is, but through my research and common knowledge that I have of these types of engines, it seems that most likely the prime mover these locos are utilizing is the Wabtec L250 MDA inline 6-cylinder diesel engine. The L250s are turbocharged marine engines designed for use on small boats. The inline designation simply means that all of the combustion chambers and cylinders are mounted straight up and down and in a line from front to back. The auxiliary and main electrical generator flywheels present on the block are the main indicators to me that this is most likely the prime mover these engines have inside. The L250 MDA is also the first and only 6-cylinder engine that Wabtec has yet produced to comply with the Tier 4 emission standards, and it's also, to my knowledge, the first kind of marine engine to ever be utilized in the railroad industry. And I suppose such is also evidence as to why these things kind of sound like a tugboat as they roll up and down the track. While on the topic of sound, there's also something rather interesting about the two horns on these locomotives that I'll try not to discuss too deeply here, as I'm going to have a video about nothing but train horns soon in which I'll discuss this further. But effectively, the single horn chord you're hearing is that of a Nathan K5HL horn, 3 of the chimes for which are mounted facing forward on top of the long hood behind the cab, and the other 2 mounted in the radiator at the very back of the engine as a separate horn unit. And to get the 5-chime chord of a K5HL, both of these separate units sound at the exact same time. Because the 5 chimes are separated, rather than a K5HL, we have a K1L13 and a K24 horn respectively. And all of this will be further explained in my future video about train horns, but for now I think it's pretty neat that these 2 separate horns sound at the same time. Jumping ahead of the W955 for another shot of the train on the curve at Bushnell. And one last leap ahead for a final shot of the train just south of Lake Panasoffkee at a familiar spot of ours that we call Ashley. Notice how the sound produced by the train's horn doesn't obtain that whiny, almost squeaky tone until the locomotive passes us. That's that second horn unit in the back of the engine that you're hearing as both sound at the same time. You hear the first 3 as it's coming at you, and the last 2 as it's going away. This fairly telephoto straightaway also puts into perspective that this was the longest work train that I have ever seen on CSX before. This train was pretty much all gondolas, and though I didn't get an exact length anywhere, I'd easily say that this guy was over a mile long. I never got any actual confirmation on where exactly this train was coming from, but based on unrelated posts that I saw online around the same time, my guess is that this train was actually returning from the U.S. Sugar Railroad. They were replacing a ton of ties along their Clewiston system around this time of the year, and this ginormous train was now completely empty, insinuating to me that they had likely unloaded the whole thing on U.S. Sugar, and what we were seeing now was the return trip of the whole consist back on CSX. Making sense also then that this train was profiled out of Winter Haven, which isn't too far north of the Sebring interchange to U.S. Sugar. Either way, this is definitely not something you see on CSX every day, and we were definitely privileged to come across this guy by sheer chance. But at milepost S771 is where we conclude the chase of the W955, and where we would also then conclude this video. Hopefully y'all either learned something, laughed a little bit, or got some general enjoyment out of this one, as we kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone here. 2 very interesting trains with some very interesting power. And I hope that for any one of those reasons, you'll stick around for the next video that I eventually put out. Thanks again so much for watching, and at milepost S771 on the Wildwood subdivision, this is Kotabeaner, and I'll see you next time somewhere along the Sunshine State Rails.